All right, buckle up, everybody, because today we are taking a deep dive into a place with a really fascinating and kind of spooky history.
Oh, yeah, a place that has definitely captured people's imaginations for a long time.
We're talking about the Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum, and I think it's safe to say that most people associate this place with
Ghosts.
exactly ghosts and ghost stories and paranormal activity. But today, we're going to go beyond all that.
We're going deeper.
Yes, much deeper into the real history of the asylum. And it's surprisingly complex.
Oh, absolutely. And we have a great source to help us unravel it all.
That's right. The Wikipedia article on the Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum is surprisingly detailed, and it really gives a sense of just how much this one location reflects.
Like broader American history, like social attitudes towards mental health, the evolution of treatment approaches.
It's all there.
Yeah.
So today we're diving into the architecture of the changing social landscape and how our understanding of mental illness has evolved over time.
It's a journey through history for sure.
Absolutely. So let's start by rewinding the clock way back to the 1850s, a time before the Civil War even began. What was the original vision for this asylum?
Well, it was actually intended to be a place of progressive care, a beacon of hope, in a way, for those suffering from mental illness.
Really?
Yeah, the architect, Richard Snowden Andrews, he used the Kirkbride Plan for the design.
The Kirkbride Plan. What was that all about?
It was a pretty revolutionary approach for the time. The goal was to create this healing environment for patients. Imagine spacious rooms bathed in natural, light, fresh air circulating throughout.
It sounds almost idealistic, especially for that era.
It really was, and it was all based on this idea of moral treatment, treating patients with dignity and respect.
I see. So the physical surroundings were considered crucial for recovery.
Exactly. They believed that light ventilation, a serene environment, all of that played a huge role in the healing process. It was a far cry from the asylums of the past, which were often cramped and dark and really inhumane.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So how did that translate into the physical structure of the Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum?
Well, the Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum was built on a grand scale. It was designed to house 250 patients, and the main building itself is one of the largest hand-cut stone structures in the entire United States.
Wow, that's massive. It must have been a colossal undertaking to build something like that back then.
Absolutely. Construction started in 1858, and it was a long and challenging process, especially when you consider the fact that the Civil War erupted right in the middle of construction.
Oh, right, the Civil War. I can only imagine how that impacted a project of this scale.
It had a huge impact. Construction was halted, funds were seized by Union forces, and the unfinished building was even occupied by both sides at different points in time.
Wow, so this place intended for healing was caught right in the middle of this huge national conflict.
It's almost poetic in a way, a reflection of the turbulent times.
Definitely. And it seems like the asylum story is interwoven with the nation's history right from the start.
Exactly. And even after the war, the asylum continued to reflect the changes happening in society. Just look at the name, for example. It went from the Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum to the West Virginia Hospital for the Insane.
Yeah, it's interesting how the name itself reflects the evolving language surrounding mental health.
Yeah.
What's the significance of that shift from lunatic to insane?
Well, lunatic was a term rooted in really outdated beliefs, like linking mental illness to the moon's cycles.
Ah, I see.
It carried a lot of stigma with it. It was dehumanizing. Insane, while still not perfect, marked a move towards a more medicalized view of mental health.
Makes sense, though, even then it was still far from the understanding we have today.
Oh, absolutely. But it's a good reminder to think about the language we use even today when talking about mental health. But going back to the asylum, it was actually designed to be incredibly self-sufficient, even amidst all these changes.
Oh, you mean like a self-sustaining community within the asylum itself?
Exactly. They had a working farm, a dairy, their own waterworks, and even a cemetery on the grounds. It was like its own little world out there, pretty isolated from everything else.
It makes you wonder about the impact of that isolation. On the one hand, it might have fostered a sense of community, but on the other, isolation can make it easier for problems to go unnoticed or even worse, ignored.
That's a really important point, and unfortunately, as we move into the 20th century, that's exactly what we're going to see with the asylum. Those hidden problems, they become impossible to ignore any longer.
Okay, so things are about to take a turn.
A darker turn, yes.
All right, well then, let's get into it.
Let's do it.
As we move into the 20th century, things at the Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum start to get pretty grim.
Yeah, the Wikipedia article talks about this period of intense overcrowding. It was originally designed for 250 patients.
Right.
But by the 1950s, it was housing over 2,600. That's more than 10 times its capacity.
Wow. That's just mind-boggling, and I can only imagine the impact that must have had on the patients and the staff.
It was a recipe for disaster, and this was at a time when our understanding of mental health was still so limited.
Yeah, the article mentions they were admitting people for things like laziness or egotism. I mean, those don't exactly sound like reasons for institutionalization by today's standards.
It's a stark reminder of how much our views on mental health have changed. What might be considered a personality quirk today was often seen as a serious mental illness back then.
It's kind of a scary thought. And it wasn't just the overcrowding, it was also this lack of understanding of what actually constituted mental illness. The article highlights this with a report from 1938.
Right. That report shows just how much the asylum was struggling. It housed a mix of patients with all sorts of needs, epilepsy, addiction, developmental disabilities, all alongside severe mental illness, and there just wasn't the specialized care or understanding to meet those needs.
It's heartbreaking to think about all the individuals who were essentially lumped together, regardless of their actual condition.
And the staff must have been overwhelmed too, trying to care for so many people with such diverse needs in such a crowded environment.
And on top of all that, the Charleston Gazette ran a series of reports in 1949 detailing some truly appalling conditions at the asylum.
Those reports are hard to read. They talk about inadequate sanitation, not enough furniture, poor lighting, a lack of heating in many areas. It paints a pretty bleak picture.
And yet there was one wing that had been renovated, described as comparatively luxurious.
Yeah, it's a strange contrast within the asylum itself. Some areas had decent conditions while others were just neglected.
It really highlights those disparities in care and how easily vulnerable people could slip through the cracks of a system that was clearly under immense strain.
Absolutely. And unfortunately, things didn't really improve much in the following decades. In fact, the asylum became involved in a pretty controversial project, the West Virginia Lobotomy Project.
Right. That was in the early 1950s. And I think we all know now that lobotomies are considered a very flawed and often harmful procedure.
Definitely they were performing these lobotomies as a way to try and alleviate overcrowding, but it was a misguided attempt at a solution, and ultimately it just caused more harm.
It's a dark chapter in the asylum's history, for sure, and all of this ultimately led to its closure in 1994.
Right, the closure was a long time coming, really. It was a result of growing awareness about the inhumane conditions, changes in how we approach mental health care, and a series of legal challenges.
It was a turning point, but it didn't erase the asylum's complex legacy, and the building itself still stands today. So what happened to it after the asylum closed its doors?
Well, it went through a period of uncertainty, really. There were several attempts to repurpose it. Some people wanted to turn it into a Civil War museum. Others thought it could be a hotel or even a golf course.
A golf course? That's an interesting idea.
It is, but none of those plans ever materialized. It seemed like nobody quite knew what to do with this massive, historically charged building.
I guess it's not easy to reconcile the past with the present, especially with a place like this.
And in 2007, the asylum was purchased at auction by Joe Jordan, an asbestos demolition contractor.
Really? An asbestos demolition contract? You'd have to wonder what his plans were for a place like that.
I know, right? But he decided to turn the asylum into a tourist attraction.
A tourist attraction. So it's open to the public now.
Yes. It offers historical tours, paranormal tours. They even host events and ghost hunts.
It's an interesting approach, kind of a blend of historical preservation and what some people might call dark tourism.
It's definitely sparked some debate about how we should engage with places like this. Is it okay to turn a former asylum into a source of entertainment?
It's a complex question.
Yeah.
And there are definitely ethical considerations to take into account.
For sure. On one hand, you have people who believe that these sites should be solely dedicated to remembrance and reflection.
And then on the other hand,
you have those who see value in using them to educate people, to spark conversations about the past and about mental health.
Delicate balance, for sure. And the Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum has definitely captured the public's imagination. It's been featured in TV shows, documentaries, video games, even a Pulitzer Prize-winning novel.
It's true. This place has become a cultural touchstone in many ways, but it's important to remember the real human stories behind all the hype.
This deep dive has really highlighted how multifaceted the Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum is. It's a place of architectural grandeur, a reflection of changing social attitudes, a site that forces us to confront some uncomfortable truths about our past and even our present.
And we're not done yet. There's still more to explore in part 3. We'll delve even deeper into the asylum's cultural impact and consider some thought-provoking questions about how we engage with the past.
Stay tuned, folks. We'll be right back after a short break. So we've talked about how the Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum has really made its way into popular culture, like documentaries and TV shows.
Yeah, it's been in video games too, and even a Pulitzer Prize-winning novel. It's quite a range.
It is, and it really speaks to how certain places like this asylum, with its imposing architecture and its really layered history,
They capture the imagination, don't they?
yeah, they become part of our cultural narratives.
Yeah.
I'm curious about the impact of all these portrayals. Like, do they help or hurt the asylum's legacy, especially when it comes to understanding its more nuanced and often really difficult past?
That's a good question, and I think it's kind of a double-edged sword.
Okay, how so?
Well, on one hand, these portrayals, even the ones that are more sensationalized, they introduce the asylum to a wider audience, you know?
Right.
They spark curiosity, and that might lead some people to dig a little deeper to actually learn more about the history and the complex issues surrounding mental health treatment.
So it's like a gateway.
In a way, yes, but on the other hand, there's always the risk of oversimplification. You know, boiling the asylum's history down to just its spooky elements or turning it into a spectacle.
Yeah, just for entertainment.
Exactly. And it's
Yeah.
important to remember that this was a place where real people lived, worked, and suffered.
Real people with real stories.
Exactly. Their experiences are central to the asylum's history.
It's about finding that balance, I guess.
Yeah, between acknowledging the human stories, the real struggles that took place, while also recognizing the building's historical and architectural significance.
And not exploiting the past for entertainment or profit.
Right. Approaching its legacy with sensitivity and a commitment to accuracy.
Makes you wonder what the former patients and staff would think about how the asylum is perceived today.
That's a really interesting question, isn't it? It underscores the importance of respecting their stories, remembering that the asylum's history isn't just about the building, but about the lives that were intertwined with it.
I know we've been looking at the bigger picture, but what personally stood out to you about the Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum? Like, what aspect of this deep dive resonated with you the most?
For me, it's the architecture. The fact that it was designed with this intention of healing, of creating a therapeutic environment. It's really fascinating, you know.
Yeah.
The Kirkbride Plan, while flawed in its execution, it represented a genuine attempt to provide more humane care for those struggling with mental illness.
It's a good reminder that even back then, amidst less enlightened views on mental health, there were people who were striving for compassion and understanding.
Exactly. It speaks to how our approach to mental health care has evolved over time. You know, we've learned from past mistakes and we continue to search for better ways to support those in need.
It's been quite a journey, hasn't it? Uncovering the history, the architecture, the cultural impact of this place.
I agree. It's a reminder that even seemingly abandoned places like the Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum can hold so much meaning and offer valuable insights into our past, our present, and even our future.
Well said. And for our listeners, we hope this deep dive has sparked your curiosity and maybe even given you a new perspective on this often misunderstood piece of history.
Remember, learning is a continuous process. Keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep engaging in thoughtful conversations about mental health and the spaces that have shaped its history.
Couldn't have said it better myself. Yeah. Thanks for joining me on this deep dive into the Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum.
It's been my pleasure.